Hi, this is Julie, and welcome to Throwback Thursday. In honor of Mother's Quest turning 5, this season 7 of the podcast will bring episodes to you every Thursday. In addition to new episodes, we'll also share some powerful conversations from the archives. Keep in mind while listening that you may hear about some events or offerings that are no longer current. But whether you've heard this episode before or it's new to you, I hope you'll find something here as relevant as ever to light your way. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to 2 high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? I'm honored to bring you such a powerful and important conversation on the podcast today with a woman who has already impacted my life and my children's life, Ashia Ray of Raising Luminaries and Books for Littles. Ashia is a multiracial, Chinese-Irish, autistic neurodiversity rights advocate and the mother of 2 Kyriarchy smashing young children. As the founder of Raising Luminaries, she helps parents and educators ignite the next generation of kind and brilliant leaders. Thousands of parents like me, on a quest to tackle hard topics with our children, turn to Ashia, who through her thoughtfully researched and child-tested book lists at booksforlittles.com and in her private group, helps us find the best books to foster age-appropriate conversations with our kids about white supremacy, sexism, ableism, and more. By using picture books to make hard conversations easier and to introduce complex topics simply, Books for Littles also educates grown-ups like me who then go on to have ongoing discussions with our littles and our extended community. I love the opportunity to delve deeply into how Ashia experiences the world as an autistic adult and mother, how we can deepen our own awareness, understanding, and advocacy for neurodiversity, and how we can fight all the isms, smashing the hierarchy, the intersection of them all, through the power of books. Before I share my biggest takeaways from our conversation, I want to introduce my friend Kate Amu-Gottfried with this episode's dedication.
Hi, I'm Kate Amu-Gottfried, and I'm honored to dedicate this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast to my 2 sons, Marlo and Miles, and to the group of women teaching me what it means and how to be an activist. Tonight, my sons and I read a children's book called The King of Kindergarten, which was very fitting as my 5.5-year-old autistic son Marlo begins his first day of kindergarten tomorrow. Ashia Ray and Books for Littles has been an inspiration for me and my children through her carefully curated book lists and reviews, but also her personal brand of seeing and being in the world. Ashia is somehow able to hold it all simultaneously. She consistently identifies all of the isms and the impact of their regular intersections. She has introduced me to the idea of the hierarchy, and as a voice I will return to over and over again as I learn what it means to be an allistic parent to an autistic child. Ashia's voice and experience about what it means to be biracial in America also hits home. I'm the white mother to biracial sons. My husband is an immigrant from Ghana, a large Black man in America who is also the beneficiary of incredible educational and professional opportunities, and whose success has brought great financial and social capital to our family. I know I will revisit this episode with Ashia to be regularly reminded about being intersectional in our work, but also interdependent in our lives as mothers, daughters, professionals, and the myriad elements of our own identities. I'm committed alongside Ashia and Julie to raising kind and courageous kids, as well as to my political activism to make the world a little kinder and safer for my children and for all humans with whom we share this little ball hurtling around the sun. As I've grown in my activism over the past year, I want to thank Abella Akobi, Dr. Khadija Costley White, Regina Islas, Ginny Kraus, and Danya Rajendra for their fierce activism and leadership. These are each teachers whom I deeply admire. I will close with a quote from my college friend Danya. She writes, "Solidarity is the idea that we don't have to be the same to want the best for one another, that we can keep each other safe, we can share what we have, that we can find our way to consensus about how best to be in community together, better known as democracy, and that we will fight for it and for one another." As she says regularly, solidarity is my superpower. To Asia Ray and Julie Neal, thank you for your solidarity and for sharing a glimpse of your many superpowers.
Kate, your beautiful dedication to your boys and to the women who teach you about activism brings me to tears every time I hear it. Thank you for honoring Asia and our podcast with your own powerful story of navigating being an holistic parent to an autistic child in a biracial family, and for all the ways that you act in solidarity and that most beautiful definition of the word that you shared. This idea that we don't have to be the same to want the best for each other connects to everything that Asia embodies. And just as my last episode with Pamela Slim and Desiree Attaway made me feel like I wanted to be a better friend, this conversation and the micro challenge that Asia gave us made me want to be a kinder, more inclusive human being. In addition to saying yes to providing captions to photos in anything I post, I also committed to providing a transcript for this episode. I hope you will not only listen, but also read through the transcript, as this conversation is so full of insights that I found myself needing to go back over again and again. I hope what Asia shares will help you, as it did me, to see things from a new perspective and feel inspired to smash the Kyriarchy in your own ways in your epic life. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Asia, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. I am so excited to have this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this experience because it's almost like a completely different culture of my more concrete, autistic kind of oriented population. And then the kind of journey and quest and listening to the language of your podcast, it's like a completely new world for me. So I'm kind of excited to experience this.
Yes, I got permission from you to share as part of our recording what you were telling me before we officially started, which is that when you got the interview questions, and you've also been listening to some of the podcast episodes, well, why don't I let you go ahead and share what your experience was and then what you did to prepare for today?
On a podcast, I like to listen to a few episodes, and it's funny because listening to the episodes, I found myself having to stop and go back and replay and be like, wait, what does that mean? Because as an autistic person, and not all autistic people, but a lot of us use pragmatic language that's more literal. I mean, there are autistic poets, but for me, poetry makes no sense because you have to do that mental leap from the metaphor of what this word means into the scope and translate it basically into concrete language and actual real events. And for me, when I listen to words like epic journeys, what I'm picturing is a man wearing a wizard hat and some elves. And I'm like, wait, what does that mean? Because I have to translate all of that into a podcast, like on how to be a parent. It was kind of like doing a lot of calculus, except calculus is way easier for me, listening to the podcasts. And like, I knew that you guys were saying great things and amazing things. It was kind of like translating from French. When I was preparing for, the epic guidelines and the post questions, I ended up last night texting my husband who wasn't around, and I was asking him, like, what does this mean? And luckily he has an autistic father. So he was raised by someone who speaks literally. And even though he's holistic, he's non-autistic, he knows he has a very easy time translating. For me is obviously one of the reasons why we get along so well. So forwarding him the questions and then having him translate them into more pragmatic language for me so that way I could understand and answer them. And it was funny because his insight onto the intent behind the questions was completely different than what I was reading into them. It was just so much translation that I was getting lost in the little details about words like treasures. And he was like, oh, this is what that means. I'm like, oh, okay, that is a question I can answer. He's a very helpful person to have around.
Yes. Thank you to your husband for that incredible role of being the translator. And, as I heard you share that with me today, one thing I thought immediately is that you're not the only one who's had that experience. And so I know that sometimes these words also just don't resonate with people, but I'm really appreciating what you're saying about that they also don't make literal sense, that they're broken down. So we agreed today that as I asked my questions, that you would provide what the translation was, which I think will be so eye-opening and helpful, not only for me, but for other people who are listening. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and officially start. Oh, before we do, I thought of one other thing as you were sharing. I know this because we've had a conversation before, but for people who haven't heard the term allistic before, could you tell us what that means?
Yeah. So typically when you hear about things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, you see them as a deficit. They're seen through the medical model of disability, which is the dominant narrative that we have in this country. There's the norm, and then there's any deviation from the norm is something to be fixed or a deficit or even a burden on society. The disability rights movement looks more through the social model of disability, which is it's a natural variation in the human brain, the same way that skin color or eye shape is. When we speak about things like that, we need to center the people who are being erased from the narrative. For instance, a lot of people say this person has autism as if it's like a disease or something, like they have cancer, as if you can separate it from the person. But we're very cerebral animals, and you can't separate your neurology from something. So when you say, I love my child, but I hate their autism, it's like saying, I love my child, but I hate their Asianness, or I hate something that is so integral to their identity that it's actually very, very harmful. So the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of autistic people prefer to be called, they say, I am autistic, rather than I have autism. And this is something that has been reported. So when we center autism, we also say, instead of saying, normal people or average people, sometimes we say neurotypical people, which is you kind of fall into that average. Or allistic means not autistic, but you could otherwise be neurodivergent. You could be divergent from the standard mean. And allistic just means you're not autistic. You could be ADHD or dyslexic, but if you're not autistic, then we refer to you as allistic.
Got it. Okay. Really helpful. And I know the first time that you told me this, it was so eye-opening for me because I think many parents who are not neurodivergent, who maybe have a child who's been diagnosed with something, we feel like the labels can be harmful. And in my first conversation with you, which was now months ago, it was so evident how much that framing can make what is a core part of someone's identity can be really harmful and make somebody feel like a part of who they are is not something that can be embraced and valued.
Yeah, very much. And I call to mind, like, there's this scene in Arrested Development, the TV show, where one of the main characters meets a Mexican woman. And he's like, I know you can call yourself that word, but what do I call you? And she's like, Mexican. And he's like, but I can't say it, because he already has this stigma that Mexican is somehow a slur or a negative thing. If you divorce the idea that being autistic is a bad thing, being Black or Asian or a woman or non-binary is a bad thing, then it kind of feeds into that narrative of the other is bad. So once you accept, when someone says, call me autistic, it's not an insult because there's nothing wrong with being autistic.
Thank you for shining light on that. I think it's so important. And I know we'll probably come back to this again in the conversation, but let's start where we normally start, which is tell me a little bit about your childhood and the impact that your mother has had in shaping who you are.
If we back it up into, actually, this is very telling. My mother was one of 10. She was born Irish Catholic in Boston, in a very, very Irish Catholic family. And unfortunately, her parents were not able to give her the emotional support that she needed. We had some mental health conditions and some addiction issues. So she basically kind of raised herself and pulled together with her siblings to raise each other. She's tough. Like, that's kind of Boston Irish are tough. They can get things done. They're tenacious and they can take a few hits. So my mother grew up very much knowing that even though her mother's currency was beauty, and her mother taught her, like, grow up, be beautiful, get married, and that's how you'll survive. My mother didn't want that. She didn't want her currency to be beauty. She wanted her currency to be strength and tenacity. So My mother ended up growing up being, even though she herself was neurodivergent, although undiagnosed because she was a girl and she was poor and people don't get the diagnosis and support they need in those circumstances. She's ADHD and dyslexic, so people thought she was stupid. So she dropped out of school when she was about 11 years old to help raise her younger siblings. But somehow she managed to start her own business. Eventually, she went to college when I was in high school. She got her degree. She raised me alone as a single mother during the Reagan administration, where single mothers were basically like a scourge on humanity. Growing up, seeing this tiny woman who's very, very strong and tenacious and able to do things despite her disabilities, undiagnosed disabilities at that. I was reading, I think, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when I was a teenager, and there was a reference to the woman being made of thin, invisible steel. And I was like, yep, that's my mom, for sure, definitely. So I was raised with this very strong mother, and she knew that she didn't want my currency to be beauty, but she also knew that beauty was a privilege. And she didn't necessarily want my life to be hard like hers was. So she really focused on making my currency brains. So, she fought tooth and nail to get me the best education she could possibly find, which unfortunately means at that time in public school, moving to a very white neighborhood because they're the ones with the resources. So as a multiracial kid living in a white neighborhood, there are other obstacles that, she couldn't have foreseen as a white woman, but she did absolutely everything in her power to make sure that I had the things that I needed. Unfortunately, I was also, not unfortunately for being autistic, but I was undiagnosed as autistic. People just attributed my social disabilities and sensory disabilities to other things. So there's the stereotype of submissive Asian girl. So when I was shy or having social anxiety, I would retreat. People would attribute that to my race. When I couldn't do something, people attributed it to having the scourge on humanity, a single mother not having a lot of money and living in that sort of circumstance. So I actually didn't realize that I was autistic until I was basically a mother. And knowing and then working through that releasing of the stigma has been really helpful. And I went almost overnight from being confused as a child, having no friends, very little social skills, because you can't learn what you don't know that you don't know. Like a lot of people are born with the social skills that I've had to learn academically through books, basically. So my childhood very much felt lonely and quite like I grew up in the back of a hair salon just watching TV, like listening to movies while my mom worked because she couldn't afford childcare. And now my children have a very different life, which I feel like we can all attribute to how hard she worked for that.
Tell me a little bit about what the process was like and how you were able to get diagnosed and then what changed for you.
I keep hearing this for a lot of adults is what happens is a child in their life gets diagnosed as autistic. The child is having some issues. They're luckily in a school or a community where they actually have access to the resources to get a proper identification for how they're wired. My husband actually, because he was raised by an autistic man who also was not diagnosed until after I was diagnosed, he tends to collect autistic people because he just connects with us and he knows how we talk and he thinks we're delightful. Not like a hobby, but like he just tends to be drawn to people who speak the way that I speak. So his friend's daughter was so much like me that even my mother was shocked by the way that she moved and the way that she talked and the way that she interacted with other people. She's like, that teenager's just like you. And I just thought she was the coolest kid. She's the most normal kid ever. And then one day, Nathan, my partner, comes home and he says like, oh, so this girl was diagnosed as autistic. Because she was diagnosed as autistic, her dad also found out that he's autistic. So my good friend and his daughter are autistic. And I was like, but they're the most normal people I know. They're not like the people on TV. They're not flapping their hands in public and they're not, like repeating the same words over and over because they, like me, know better than to do that in public. And then we didn't realize until we had this discussion that Nathan is like, but I don't even feel an urge to do these things. And I'm like, but I thought everyone feels these urges and everyone finds fluorescent lights painful and everyone has to recover for a few days after a party. It's just that everyone's tougher than me and they just bounce back faster than I do. So after learning what autism actually is beyond the very harmful stereotypes that we see in the media, I was able to understand that some things are harder for me than they are for other people. And it's okay for me to back away and pick my battles and not go to every single party because for most people, parties are enjoyable. And for me, parties are awful. It's like a spooky horror house or something. So life has just been a lot easier because instead of pouring all of my energy into being seen as normal, sitting on my hands so I don't stim, trying to figure out what's going on, translating all of this metaphorical language. I can just sit myself down and focus on what I want to do. And I have all this energy and left to be creative and to make the change that I'd like to make in the world.
And how old were you when this happened?
29 when I first got the first inklings. And then there's always like a few years of like working through and being like, no, I can't possible. I'm just being like a hypochondriac. I'm just reading into this.
And so if I'm understanding the way this happened, you were already with your husband at the time?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And he grew up with a parent who is autistic, but he hadn't identified yet these things in you?
Before you're like, I don't know any autistic people, right? And then you start to realize, particularly when you come out and you start telling people that you're autistic, as opposed to trying to hide it so you can get like clients to hire you and people not to judge you. You start to have more people also disclose like, oh, hey, I'm autistic too, or my child is autistic. And you start to realize like there are so many of us, but we're all staying quiet because of the stigma behind it.
I'm going to ask this one more question and then we'll move forward. I'm so appreciating what you're saying about the stigmas about autism and that there are so many people who are autistic that do not reflect the reality of what is so often portrayed. At the same time, I know that autism is also on a spectrum and that there are people who aren't able to communicate or might have behaviors that are more of what we see as the stereotype. Can you just share a little bit about, that distinction and how to help us think about the very real lived realities of some people on the spectrum?
Yep. So one of the things that we're working to disseminate is when we picture autism as a spectrum, a lot of people are picturing a scale, like keys on a piano. And what the spectrum actually is, it's multidimensional. It's not from very little to very much. It's 5 different points. It's more of like a color spectrum, like when you're using a color dropper. So for instance, I am hyperlexic. So autism affects language most of the time in communication. So I'm hyperlexic. I'm able to pull in lots of information, have a large vocabulary. I can express myself eloquently, whereas some people don't have spoken language. They're non-speaking. That doesn't mean that they don't communicate. A lot of people successfully communicate using keyboards, assisted communication devices, assistants, body language. It just means that my form of language is more socially accessible. I don't have as many hurdles getting through a world that's not built for autistic people. That said, I do have my own hurdles. I can hide the fact that I stim. Not all people can or choose to hide the fact that they stim. A lot of people reference like self-harming behaviors, things like that. That's a completely separate discussion, mostly revolving around control. For instance, if I start doing self-harming behaviors, that is going to be because I have lost control, and the feeling of like poking my skin gives me a little bit more control in an environment where I'm feeling immense amounts of anxiety. Mm-hmm. So there's been kind of this divide between what people call high-functioning autistics and low-functioning autistics. And what that does is that it's a tool, an unintentional tool of supremacy to divide and conquer and keep us as an oppressed group, basically. When you call someone low functioning, you're taking away their agency. You're assuming they're too incompetent to choose their own path. We're saying that if they use assisted communication, that communication isn't worthy of being listened to because it isn't eloquent. And we do the same thing to, African-American vernacular. We say, if you speak that way, then you can't be educated enough to advocate for yourself. And that's completely untrue. So for instance, on Wikipedia, Amy Sequenzia, her contributions are disregarded because she uses assisted communication. So she can't, even though she's able to communicate quite well, she's disregarded because she doesn't speak the traditional way that we find socially acceptable. At the same time, I have some significant disabilities that other people who are non-speaking and who are visibly, like you can tell that they move differently through the world, that they might not have. Like they might be socially charming. They might have an easier time transitioning from one activity to the next. And I need, for instance, if I went to the grocery store, I would need 48 hours to recover. If I go to a party, I need 6 days to plan through all of my scripts so that way I can appear non-autistic. And it's a huge amount of emotional labor. But the thing is that all of mine is hidden. So this is how we make sure that people who are seen as high functioning, which is just not even a thing, are told that their disabilities don't matter, they don't need accommodations, and that's how we keep them from speaking up and keep them from advocating for themselves. At the same time that we tell people that they're low functioning and therefore they don't even know what they need, and we need to tell them what they need.
Wow. So often in the middle of interviews, I have a part of the conversation where I know I'm going to go back and listen again. And this is one of them. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Yeah, I'm glad to share.
Out of curiosity, did that first question I asked you require translation?
No, it was great.
That one was worse.
Yeah. So it was funny because my partner's like, that first one is pretty obvious. Like, I'm like, yep, I agree. That one makes sense.
Okay, so we had one down. Well, now I want to move into what may have been feeling like the part of the conversation that's a little bit harder to grasp, this idea of living an epic life. It came to me and has really become a framework, not only for Mother's Quest, but for how I live my life, because I had been doing some reading and learning about the hero's journey, the work that the anthropologist Joseph Campbell was doing about like every classic story that we kind of learned about and read about and seen in the movies follows this kind of similar story arc of the hero or the heroine sort of answering a calling and saying yes and going on this journey and finding things they were struggling with, but also finding guides to help light the way. And then at some point reaching like, the treasure or the elixir and then, bringing that back. And I was really compelled by it, but there were many ways in which that version of the hero's journey didn't resonate for me. I've really taken on more of a feminine perspective about it, that first of all, it doesn't have to be a harrowing journey, that we could actually welcome in the experience of saying yes to the things that we really want to do in our lives, but to feel like we could do it with support. That's part of why I have this podcast. And also that we're like constantly learning, that it's not like you arrive at some destination at the end, but there are like treasures or lessons or things you value that you find all along the way. You could be sharing that with your community as you go. So I love to ask, like, what do you feel like you are on a quest for in your life, in your epic journey? And then each epic is also an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I think help us live that life when we're raising our children. So I'm going to then ask you specifically about each of those. But first of all, what was your husband's translation for this?
So first, I just want to say that it's kind of awesome to see our lives through the lens of like our life is an epic D&D adventure, like Dungeons and Dragons game. That's awesome. And like, why not have fun with it, right?
Yes.
So my partner translated that first question into, tell me what your goals are. What are you currently working on? Not nearly as magical, but very concrete.
And I think the concrete part absolutely makes sense. There is a little element of it, though, which is like when you think about your whole life or, the purpose of your life, what do you feel like that's been about?
Pretty much I sat down and thought about if I could do anything because, eventually things come together and they fall apart and we'll eventually have the heat and death of the universe. And like, we're such kind of insignificant creatures over the long cosmic universe of things. So why not just have fun with it? And given that nothing matters, what would I like to do with my life? Like I could become chaotic, anarchist, whatever. Why not just raise really kind and courageous kids and do what I see as the hardest possible thing you could do, which is give your life over in service to helping the broader community. And it's important. One of the things that I focus on, and I was discussing this with my partner, is I mainly do what I do outwardly in the public sphere because I want to show my kids that it's okay to do things even though you're not exactly sure what you're doing. And because you have a goal of just helping and being kind, even though it's not making a ton of money and even though it's not traditionally seen as a valuable thing. Like I was raised partially in, Irish Catholic, which is very like, learn how to take care of yourself, learn how to fix your own house, be self-sufficient. And on the other side, I was raised in a very Chinese family that is become a doctor, become a lawyer, become something where you make a lot of money. So that way you don't fall into the traps of poverty and targeting that they had previously fallen into in China during famines and here as immigrants. This is my way of telling my kids that, you can follow your own path and you don't necessarily have to do what the previous generation thought was best for you. At the same time, I would like them to be not evil. So although I'm multiracial, my partner is white, so my kids are very white presenting. They can pass as white. They're tall, they're smart, they're devastatingly handsome. And I'm looking at these two children who have so much privilege and they are growing up with resources that I never had, which also is a downside because it means they're growing up without the obstacles and challenges that foster compassion and empathy that I did have. So how can I raise them with all of the power that is going to be handed to them, not to accidentally trample other people and even to help lift up other people? So I'm like, well, of all of the epic journeys that I can possibly go on, why not do this remarkably difficult thing of getting people to have compassion for people, even if they're not in their shoes? Focusing on that line of no idea what I'm doing is I don't have much patience for people who say, hey, I did this and now you can too, and I'll tell you how. Because over the course, we move so fast, over the course of 5 or 10 years, things change. So parenting advice from someone who has a 20-year-old is going to be so completely different because they live in a different social sphere, different economic situation than I do, that their advice is almost useless. Like there are some insights that are pretty global and helpful. But if I wait until I know exactly what I'm doing and I make sure that my kids actually turn out not to be ex murderers, I'm not going to be at all in touch with people who have 7-year-olds now, or 7-year-olds then. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do this. This is what I'm wrestling with right now. If anyone wants to learn from my mistakes, which I will make many of, I just want to keep, accountability procedures to make sure that when I make mistakes, feel free to correct me. I will fix them. I will teach other people, and people can learn from me basically bumbling around like a silly person.
Yeah. And I resonate so much with that too, about not feeling like I have figured this all out. Like Mother's Quest is all about what am I currently on a quest for? What am I grappling with? What am I trying to learn? And then who can I learn from? Like who can help shine a light for us? And that's why the podcast has been such an incredible way to really be in it and just grapple with it, but alongside others. So I really get that. So how did you get the idea then to create Raising Luminaries?
We didn't have many resources. We don't have childcare. We moved to a city that is inclusive for multiracial people for the first time ever. This is the first time I've ever been in a place where other people look like me. We lived in a city where it's inclusive for people with disabilities, even though I didn't know that at the time when I moved in. But it also means that it's remarkably expensive. It's like, I read someplace like the third most expensive place in the country. And so we have no money because all of our money goes towards paying for this house to keep our kids in these schools so our kids can feel safe as neurodivergent Asian Americans, basically. What I do have available to me is fantastic cartoon voices and a library. So I can get free books and I can take advantage of the fact that I always wanted to be a cartoon voice by reading all these ridiculous voices with my kids. So this became one of my hyper focuses. So autistic people tend to have areas of interest, sometimes more than one, and they overlap and they come and go. But my area of hyper focus for a long time was children's books, finding the best children's books for my children. And then I realized when I came up with this idea of raising these children with privilege to be kind and courageous, I realized I can actually find the right children's books and use these as a tool. So it started out as kind of a subversive way of just teaching my kids about these issues. And then we started a Facebook group called Books for Littles, where basically I'm like, I already have several thousand books that I've gone through. I might as well share the really good ones so that way other people don't have to spend 20 hours a week searching through the library for the perfect books, testing them, vetting them, analyzing them. And I'm like, I've already done this work. Why not share it? So that turned into Books for Littles. And then after the 2016 election, suddenly a lot of parents with privilege, their bubbles were popped and they're realizing, oh, wait a second, racism exists and it wasn't solved by Martin Luther King. So what I had previously been doing is people would ask for truck books and we're like, here's a truck book and hey, here's a bonus. This truck book has female trucks and this truck book has characters of color. But I didn't want to get overt with it because I didn't want to get attacked. Now that that bubble has popped, we actually have a lot more people who are actively seeking to get uncomfortable. And that's where we're really finding our people, is the people who are like, yes, tell me the things that will make me uncomfortable so that way I can grow. And what's nice is we get away with saying a lot of radical things. Even for me, like my first thought is like, oh, ouch, like not me, I'm not like that. And then, you have to sit with that discomfort and you have to realize, oh, wait, this is actually a systemic issue. We can say things like that because of the phenomena of childism in our culture, where we assume that anything related to children is kind of insignificant, which is completely ridiculous if you think about it, because this is our next generation of leaders and power makers. Even my own parents are like, oh, you're doing the book thing. And I'm like, yeah, I'm doing the little book thing. We are making massive strides and movements and not just teaching our kids about things like racism and cissexism, but also this is a tiny step for a lot of parents who have never discussed things like this, who would never admit that they don't know, to open the book and learn things. And then from that, take one step closer and one step closer and one step closer to being more courageous and taking action.
So powerful. So you create these incredible curated lists around different topics. And I was introduced to you by Carly Magnus Hurt. Since she introduced me to you, I have definitely been, picking books here and there from your lists over time. So appreciate them. Mostly I read with my youngest, who, some of his favorite books are the ones we picked from your list. And I can tell too, as I read them, even though I'm also doing a lot of work on my own in adult spheres, how much reading these stories is helping me unpack my own bias and see things from another perspective and angle. And it's been really powerful. Thank you for the work you do, which is not little. It is really impactful.
Well, thank you. And I also do want to say, as we've been moving, and developing from books for littles to like a broader envelope of raising luminaries and like the different tools that we can use, Carly has actually been a really great source of support for that. So shout out to Carly. She's an amazing mom and a great doer, right?
She's incredible.
Yeah, so it's great because we're pulling in all these people. And, while my skill set is analyzing books and uncovering implicit bias in them and how they feed into the dominant narrative, even though they're adorable and cute, we also have, like, April is starting something called a Student Ignition Society, which is like an arm of Raising Luminaries, but it's focusing on helping teachers. Because I have a lot of teachers who ask me for like lesson plans based on the books. And I'm like, I have no idea how to do that. Let me find someone who's enthusiastically excited about it. And April she's killing it. It's awesome.
Okay, well, we'll make sure that we're going to include links to all of these different things. And I would love to be able to pass this along to the teachers at Jacob's School. So I'm so excited to hear that. Well, I feel like you started to move us already into the first guidepost, E, which is about engaging mindfully with our children and, the ways in which that you have used books to have conversations with children is really amazing and such a clear way that you do that. What else do you feel like is important for us to learn from you about the ways you've learned to engage mindfully with your children?
So both of my kids are 5 and 7, and they're at that age and they're close enough together where everything is a constant argument, right? So they come in and they argue. So I spend almost all of my time either washing dishes or in arbitration while washing dishes, with the focus of, before, teaching my children about restorative justice, which is restoring things so we're no longer doing harm. I'm not just punishing one child for doing something, but really having them listen to each other and figure out how to move forward. But now we're actually learning about transformative justice, where we find out the systemic issues and the deep-seated problems that they're having with each other, whether or not someone has had a nap, whether or not they're hungry, in transformative justice. So that's something I'm practicing right now, and I'm in the middle of it, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'll tell people about it once I've gotten a little bit of a handle on it.
So I know the term restorative justice from my work in education. Also, the idea, especially in the high school environment, that if a young person does something, that there's really an opportunity not for them just to be like punished, but to actually have them kind of repair. And sometimes that's done by bringing people together in circle and having conversation. I love the idea of bringing this restorative justice mindset to our homes, which I feel like I have not somehow made that leap. Should maybe have been obvious, but that's really powerful. I'm not sure I totally understand yet the distinction about the transformative justice. What does that look like?
Transformative justice, it has a lot to do with the prison abolition movement, where you're looking at not just having the person who has done harm take accountability and make up for it, but also look at why did they do harm and what systemic forces were in play where that person found themselves in that position. And obviously, this is completely new. I could be describing it wrong, but I'm trying to create that on a macro level. Like, how do I teach my kids about that so that this is just second nature? So when they grow up and they're the people who are deciding how we're changing prison systems and capitalism, things like that, so they can take into account systemic power imbalances, basically.
Okay, got it. So I think this is what I have been on a quest to do with my kids the last few years too. So it's really helping to educate our children about these systemic issues and inequalities and to really see it, and then also be able to step into being champions to make a difference.
Yeah.
That sound right? Okay.
Yeah, on like a 5-year-old level where like someone's screaming about a bruised banana. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So what in that example, like in our actual home, what would be the transformative justice lens on something like that?
So one of the things about it is it's messy and it doesn't always look the same. It never looks the same from time to time. So one of my kids, the autistic kid who is neurotypical, has a friend over. They're playing, they're bouncing around, and my autistic child is getting very irritated because they're not doing the proper thing. They asked him to build something out of Legos or something. He's building the thing out of Legos. They're ignoring him, and he's getting very angry because he's hooked on, he's not transitioning away, that they've moved their playtime. So they're rough and tumble. He's building Legos, they're knocking things down, and he's starting to lose it. And normally, if everything was perfect, he wouldn't lose it. He would just be like, okay, those goofballs have just moved on to this. And so what it involves is taking him away from that, giving him space to calm down, listening to him, letting him just bawl and feel his feelings, and then pointing out the different systems at play, one of which is he feels left out. He doesn't even realize that's why he's so upset, but he feels left out because they've moved on. The other thing is his brother is autistic and he doesn't understand the same way that we understand that if you start something, you got to finish it. So having him acknowledge that his way of thinking is not better or worse, but that they think differently. And it's not because they don't like him, it's just because they think differently. So he has to understand the systemic forces at play. So that way he can go back and, first of all, apologize for yelling at his brother, but also understand moving forward how to understand those systems at play. And this takes a long time. It's over the course of many days, taking his brother when the friend is no longer over and saying, hey, this is the impact of something that you think is innocent, is just like, moving from situation to situation, has an impact on your brother who thinks differently than you. And when you ask someone to do something, how to follow through, how to check in with them, how to include people who think differently and have a harder time unhooking from what they're doing.
And it requires, I think, just such a presence of mind that sometimes as parents, like we're busy doing our own thing, but to really slow down and be able to look, okay, big picture, what is really at play here?
Yeah. And I want to be clear, 99% of the time, I'm not doing this. I'm just shouting, go to your room. You guys are driving me up the wall, right? So on the few times when I actually can try and catch it, if possible, I have a book in my toolkit that kind of speaks to some of these issues. So it's really helpful having that archive where it actually starts with reading the book and being like, hey, this is kind of similar to what happened today, right? And that's kind of like coming in through the side door. So it's less of I'm trying to fix you and I'm trying to teach you, and more of like letting them understand that this happens to other people and this is a normal part of growing up.
Yeah, I love that side door, using the book in that way. Well, let's move to the next guidepost, P, which stands for passionate and purposeful. And it's about the impact that you want to make in the world. We started to talk about this already in terms of what you're on a quest for. Anything else that you want to share about the impact that you're hoping to have?
So I would really like to smash the Kyriarchy. That would be fun, which is basically like the multi-headed hydra of patriarchy, poverty, wealth inequality, racism, sexism, all of these things tied together. Like Martin Luther King spoke about the three evils of racism, poverty, and war. If you get rid of one of them, the other two will build it back up. The Kyriarchy is similar to that. If you get rid of sexism, as long as you have racism and poverty and war and violence, that will just come back. So what you really need to do is you need to dig down to what is causing, what human nature, what tendencies and biases are we feeding into that are actually feeding all of them, such as having false binaries, like believing that someone can be better than another, like believing being non-disabled, being abled is better than being disabled. Why do we believe that? How can we look at that from another perspective? So that's what we're really focusing on, is more of the deeper level things and recognizing patterns of behavior and patterns of oppression.
Yeah, I got really curious about this word Kyriarchy as I was reading your bio. We were talking a lot these days about intersectionality. And it seems like if you hold that intersectionality is important, then you really need to be all about smashing the Kyriarchy.
Exactly. So if you're having an anti-racism meeting and your anti-racism meeting isn't accessible for people who can't afford childcare, isn't accessible for people with disabilities, you're not in an ADA compliant building, you don't have an ASL interpreter, like who are you actually serving? What you're actually serving is people of color who have all of the same privileges that white people do, which is not helpful because most people of color do not have all of those privileges, who are disproportionately more likely to have wealth inequality I don't know about disability, but that kind of thing. Like, you can't really help if you're just only helping the people who are already assimilated into privilege.
The next guidepost I stands for invested in yourself, and thinking about smashing the hierarchy as like a central goal. I know it's exhausting. It's challenging. What have you found you need to be able to be a leader and such a powerful mother in this way with this really big, challenging goal in your life?
Conveniently, one of the things that upholds the hierarchy is this idea of individualism, like thorough toxic individualism, where you should be able to feed your children, cook dinner every night, work full time, pull in an income, raise your own chicken, squeeze your own orange juice, and it has to be organic. And this idea of, particularly for women, being able to do all of these things and take care of your local community and be on the PTO. And just letting go of that is a really great way of letting go of both the expectations, the completely unrealistic expectations that we put on marginalized people, but also it's remarkably hard. So, for instance, we are going to get on a plane and travel to Seattle for the first time since my children were born. I have not had the emotional energy to do something like get on a plane, never mind. Even like go to the grocery store is tough for me. Admitting that is remarkably hard because in our society, saying that you can't do something is tantamount to saying that you are lesser of a human and you're not as worthy of staying alive. And, that is an issue. Like, people justify the death and murder of disabled people because they don't contribute in the same ways as able-bodied people. So it's very, very scary to admit things like that. Asking for childcare, I do not make a living wage. I work like 60 hours a week and I still don't make minimum wage. So how do I justify paying for a babysitter, right? So learning interdependence and learning how to ask people for help is still, again, I don't know how to do this yet. I'm still working on it. Learning how to ask people for help. So my partner, luckily I didn't have to ask my partners, like, we're going to get on a plane. I know this is going to be tough for you. Our children are very loud and very active. One of them is neurodivergent. The other one is just young and bossy. He knows that me being on a plane by itself with people's perfumes and noises and the pressure change is going to be torture. So he volunteered he would take the kids, get on the plane, take a flight. I would take a separate flight to the same place. Getting that is remarkably hard because a lot of what I hear in my head is people being like, oh, well, obviously she can do things. She's too weak to be a mom in public. Of course, she can fight racism because she has someone watching her kids. Not realizing that a lot of other people have things like babysitters and someone else to mow their lawn or something like that. But my support needs are, because they're different than the norm, look like they're special needs. That's a loaded term that a lot of people with disabilities don't like, is the term special needs, because our needs aren't special. They're just different than what you see.
It's so interesting how the threads of previous podcast conversations connect, and sometimes things like fit together like a puzzle in ways I could never imagine, when I invite people to come on. But the episode just before this one was with two friends, Desiree Attaway and Pamela Slim. They've been friends for like 35 years. And one of the things that struck me about that conversation was not only how they talked about their own friendship and the ways in which they've supported each other, but the incredible web of support and the ways in which they extend themselves and also receive help with so many people in their lives, with this like network or this collective. Desiree, because she's all about, liberation, which is what she wears on her bracelet. She also explained this connection that hierarchy and patriarchy and white supremacy, all these things want us to have to, be isolated and hold it all alone. So I'm just really appreciating you bringing this same message to the forefront in a slightly different way.
So I guess that brings us to the connected part.
So yeah, last guidepost.
So what's funny is this is a significant challenge, particularly because autism, in addition to some other issues, comes with a social disability. We can't intuit from people's body language. Like when you see someone who is sad, even if they're not grimacing, you can pick up that they're sad, feel that sadness without even really thinking about it. For me, it's basically like doing a math equation, being like, okay, their eyebrows are at this angle. They're speaking at a slightly slower rate than they were previously, which means I have to remember the cadence of their words typically, and then figure out that they're sad, come up with all of the different ways that they could have been sad, and how I could have caused it. And then what ends up is it's a very isolating experience because it's expected that people would have this natural, immediate reaction. And a lot of autistic people, some people do, a lot of autistic people don't have that. So what I end up with is I don't have friends that I call when I'm sad. I don't have a support network. We don't have someone like when I was admitted to the hospital for sleep deprivation when my first son turned 1 because he hadn't slept for more than 45 minutes at a time throughout the year, day and night. We didn't have someone to call. So this is something that I've had to learn over time. And it's helpful to know I'm autistic because then I know, oh, I've just been obnoxious and I've been coming off as a jerk, right? And trying to start to ask for help because traditionally we have this thing called exposure anxiety, which is you try and make friends and then it doesn't work and then people lash out at you, but you're not sure why. And it turns out because you're doing something obnoxious, right? And it's annoying. It's very painful. I see my own son doing it. And I'm like, well, what you were doing was annoying to them and trying to give him the scaffolding that I never had. So I don't have that support network. I've been starting it since I've learned what my social disabilities are. Like I have one local friend named Carrie. She's great. I'm starting to get comfortable with asking her for things. We have April is running the Student Ignition Societies, and it's always terrifying. Asking for help is always, always, always scary, but we have to build that bridge of trust where I am pretty confident that these people are not going to smack me in the face for asking for help. So, and then also holding back that very internalized capitalistic tendency to want to offer money, because that's the only thing we value here is like we live in a capitalist society. If someone does something for you, you have to give them money for it. Ironically, people don't expect that for disabled people. People just call me and ask me for help and they don't offer anything. But I've been taught that we provide in exchange, right? So also asking for help without saying, and also I'll watch your kids for a week if you do this for me. It's very, very hard not to try and make up for it in addition, because we've already done things together that has made up for it. I don't know.
Just being able to receive without it having to be a transaction.
Yes, very painful.
Yeah. You know, just from what I've observed of you and in our initial conversation too, is how much you've also found community and real relationships in an online way, in a way that for some reasons like may feel more comfortable for you, and that is not something to be looked down upon or thought of as not real.
We were talking with someone who was doing, I think, a TV show, and they were trying to figure out where in the world to fly so that way they could see a strong autistic community. And this is a person who usually goes to like, oh, this city has a strong LGBTQ plus community, right? We're talking about the autistic community. And I'm thinking globally in terms of the people I know all around the world, or even the people in Raising Luminaries who are all neurotypes all over the world saying, we have a very strong community. Like if we need this, this is where you go. And he's like, so what do you guys go bowling? And I'm like, no, because some of us are in Australia and it's really hard to introduce this. It's so normal for me because we naturally get together online and I don't even know where most people live, even though we're connected. But for a lot of people, particularly people who didn't grow up like chatting on instant messenger in middle school, like the pre-millennial generation, I guess, explaining that our community and our relationships can be just as valuable, even if we don't look in each other's faces.
I really appreciate that. Well, we are almost at the end of our conversation, and I could definitely do this again, maybe in a part 2. Maybe we could have you do a workshop or something in the Mother's Quest community in the future. That would be of interest to you.
I love spouting information to people, so I'm more than happy.
Let's explore that. So before we move to the end, which is a chance for you to give me a challenge and then to talk about anything we're taking away from the conversation, I did promise Carly I would ask for a few recommendations. So she wanted to know, what are your top 10 favorite books? And maybe if you're open to that, we can share that in the show notes, but maybe you could just share 1 or 2 of your favorites. And then what's currently on your bookshelf?
Let's see. So my top 10 favorites, it's funny because when people say like, hey, can you give me a book list? It always depends on like, well, who are you? Like, is the experience of being neurodiverse different for you? And it's something that you've never encountered before, or do you need a validating experience? The books that I find most validating, I have a collection based on misfits, like when you don't feel like you fit in. And these are the books that I keep coming to, particularly for my kids when they're feeling lost and lonely, when they're having these social conflicts, and even when I am feeling like, oh, I tried a thing, I failed miserably. I realized that what I said was problematic. I need to come back to this, recenter myself, and then go back and be like, okay, here's what I learned. So there's a book collection of books that help you feel validated when you don't fit in. So like Red a Crayon Story, Where Oliver Fits, Spork by Keo McClear, which is really helpful for multiracial people particularly. Not Quite Narwhal, those kinds of books that speak to that sense. And also connecting with your epic journey idea is the people who don't fit in, they kind of have to go out into the world and learn who they are, even though the world tells them that they are not something. So growing up biracial, you have Asian people telling me that I'm not Asian enough, and white people telling me I'm not white enough, people saying like, oh, this is where we belong and go back to your own country and that kind of thing. Like, I have no country to go back to, right? Like, there's no one place where everyone looks like me and I belong there. So having that floaty feeling, in addition to being autistic and not really understanding why I don't understand other people, it very much resonates with me, that this sense of not belonging and not being enough and not fitting in. So those are my favorite books to kind of ground me and remember that, like, you know, actually everyone feels that way.
And so we could put a link in the show notes to the group of books that you have curated under this sort of for misfits.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
I keep changing. It's funny because I change the titles of these things all the time because, you know, like to try and see what titles are connecting with people.
Yeah.
And something as simple as changing a title, you'll go from like no traffic to like 15,000 people visited a day.
Wow.
And it's amazing how those tiny little tweaks really change whether or not someone feels like it resonates with them. So honestly, I've changed the title of this so much, and very people actually pay attention to it. And I think it's mostly because most people don't understand that their children, even if they don't feel like misfits in their own families, will go out into the world and feel that way. And they might not tell their parents, because this is something most kids don't come home and be like, I'm a loser. Right? And it's great if they do, but they're not always going to tell you that. So these are the books that we need to read before the kids start to feel like that, so they have the scaffolding knowing that they're not alone.
Yeah. And one of our absolute favorites that you recommended that I think would come into this category is called Where Oliver Fits.
Yeah, that's such a good book. And
so good.
Despite the puzzle piece imagery, because for autistic people, a lot of us the puzzle piece imagery is very loaded because an organization called Autism Speaks uses it, and they reinforce a lot of stereotypes off of autistic people. They profit non-autistic people at our expense, and they also advocate for the erasure and basically eugenics of removing autistic people from society. So a lot of us view it as a hate group. So when we see that puzzle piece in relation to anything, we just kind of like back off and get a little like, you even said the word puzzle earlier, and I kind of wince, even though it had nothing to do with autism.
Yeah.
So it's been kind of a hurdle to be like, no, even though there's a puzzle here, it's a really good book.
Yes. Thank you for what you just shared too, again, about the bigger perspective about the way that, you know, even a large organization like that portrays people who are autistic and the impact that it has on you, you know, down to the fact that even just hearing the word puzzle really gives you like an immediate visceral reaction. So much appreciation for what you're doing. Thank you. Thank you. I will continue to be a follower, and you have a Patreon site. And I was looking at that yesterday. I'm excited to become an official patron as well.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Every time, yeah, it's one of those things like asking for help. And then every time someone does, I'm like, oh no, but thank you. But yes, but like, oh gosh. And then, you know, fighting that urge to create even more things for them in addition to like the ridiculous amount of stuff that we're already creating. Yeah, it's a weird balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, you are creating incredibly valuable work in the world and should be valued and compensated for that. Period.
Thank you. And you too. You're doing amazing work.
Thank you. It's funny. Every time I think we're at the end, I think of one more thing I want to ask you, or one more thing we actually haven't done yet. So it is almost time for acknowledgements. But before we do that, this is an opportunity for you to give me a challenge.
A challenge. So I like to start with very, very small micro challenges that I feel like are easy enough, but also force you to self-internalize as I'm the kind of person who does this. And therefore you take it forward even when someone's telling you not to. And then you might pick up other habits that fall into that identity. So a challenge that I would really love to see is people putting image descriptions on their pictures on social media. So one of the benefits of this is people with low vision, blind people can actually understand what the image is. And when you're speaking, it doesn't feel like they don't have that wall of being like, oh, they care about people, but they don't care about me. They don't care about my experience or whether or not I can parse what's going on here.
Yeah.
And it also is helpful for people who have low connection, which disproportionately is people who don't have enough money for a really good internet connection or at the library and are relying on spotty technology. They can't see those images because they just don't load as fast. So this is accessible for multiple people. And it doesn't have to be fancy. It'd be like an image description before every image is saying this is a picture of a mother and her child. And you can make it flowery or you can make it simple. And I won't post, I actively, intentionally don't post a lot of things that I would love to post because I don't have time to write an image description. And a lot of people push back saying, well, I don't have any blind friends, or like, this isn't made for blind followers. And I'm like, well, then who is it for? And also, you're not going to get any blind friends if you keep talking about it like this, right? Like, if their experience doesn't matter to you as a human experience, that is bigotry.
Yes. So first of all, I've been noticing your posts and some other people that are very consciously doing this. I've been curious about it and I've been thinking to myself, this isn't something I do. What does that mean that I'm not choosing to take the time? There's obviously a real need and benefit for doing this. And I've also been noticing, just because I've been more focused on the anti-racism work, but the other places where I haven't been doing as much work, where I have not been, consciously adding my pronouns to things. I recently did add pronouns to my LinkedIn profile. But this whole Kyriarchy thing about like, well, it's not okay just to say you're working on anti-racism, but then all of these other isms continue to pervade your life and you're not growing in terms of your awareness and how you're being an advocate for those things.
Yeah. And I want to stress that it's not an overnight thing. Like, I don't expect everyone to do all image descriptions on everything and also add all of their pronouns every time they meet a new person. You start with just one thing, do it for a couple of weeks, a month or so. And then once it becomes a habit, then you can pick up the next thing. You don't have to immediately jump in because otherwise it'll be too much. So my subversive hope is that once you get used to doing these image descriptions, you'll start to feel like the kind of person who values people with different abilities. So for instance, your podcast, I couldn't find transcripts for. Yeah. So a transcript would have been immensely helpful for me because I was on my tiny little iPod trying to go back and forth and listen. And I also have some auditory processing issues. So like I can't listen to lectures unless I have, I'm in prime condition, which I'm not always in. So a transcript is very helpful for people with auditory issues and also, obviously people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So transcripts change the way that your podcast is done, even though it's very, very hard. I do transcripts from my videos from my transporters, and it's time consuming. It's a lot to ask. That's why I ask just for image descriptions. And then hopefully you'll just kind of move naturally towards that in the next year or so.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I commit to, so in addition to saying yes to trying in micro steps about adding image descriptions, I'll also commit to, for sure, doing a transcription of this episode.
That would be wonderful because I've got all these podcasts where I have planned to do my own transcriptions and I just don't have the time.
Yes.
But that would be really helpful.
That's an honor to do that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this time. I am so appreciative of who you are and the work that you do and all of the insights that you shared. A few key takeaways, and maybe you can help me figure out how to articulate this. It was what you were describing about, like, I guess the hidden emotional labor was the word that you were using. What is it that you would want all of us to know and do differently, though, as a result of knowing that, to be more compassionate?
So one interesting thing is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, and it's incomplete, is spoon theory. I want to say it's Christine Misandro. I can't remember her name exactly, but if you include this link in the show notes, she has an article about, so she has chronic pain and I think MS. So she was trying to explain to a friend what it's like to move through life with this disability, whereas her friend does not have it. So she was in a diner, she grabbed all the spoons and she's like, okay, to get up in the morning takes one spoon. So she takes a spoon away from her friend and she's like, okay, I can either call and pay an electric bill or I can go to the store and this one will take 4 spoons and this one will have 5 spoons. And the friend's like, but I only have like 10 spoons. And she's like, well, you have to pick which ones you're going to do so you can get through the day. And then she's out of spoons and she's like, but I want more spoons. And she's like, you can't have more spoons. So one of the shortcuts that we say, particularly for people who are supporting us, is like, I'm out of spoons. So I say that to my partner. I'm like, I'm out of spoons. And he's like, okay. And he knows I can't take emotional labor. I can't take decisions. He knows what it looks like. He knows he needs to take the kids out of the house so I can have some quiet.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is building a sense, and this is actually one of my takeaways, a lot of building a sense of trust and establishing like, here's what's going to happen if you ask me for help. I promise this, and this will happen. I actually built this into a formal accountability statement on my website. I say, if you call me out, or preferably call me in, but if you call me and say, I have been using problematic language, I am not going to attack you. I am not going to out you. I'm going to keep your private information private. I am going to go through all of the incidences on my social media, on my website where I've misused this word. And if it's not relevant, I'll just get rid of it. But if it's a learning experience, I can say, hey, just to let you people know, I misused that word. It's problematic for this reason and this reason. Let's all learn from this. So I have a clear and definitive statement of what is going to happen to you if you come to me, so that way I don't lash out. So the way that you set up your podcast is, what can I do to make this more accessible? And you said that right at the beginning, right? That gives me an out to be like, well, I'm having some problem with the flowery language. And I could hear you taking time to actually think about that, which makes me feel much safer in asking you for help with things in the future, helping me through that ask. And that's just really all you need to do, is just be like, hey, I just want to create a safe space so you know what the results are going to be if you ask me for help. And I won't be able to do everything. If I can, what can I do? Just asking, right?
Yeah.
Or even better, instead of asking someone to come up, like someone unfortunately had something really traumatic happen to them. And my first response is, I want to be like, what can I do to help? But also knowing that me asking is also asking them to do the emotional labor of identifying what they need, and then asking me to do it with the possible repercussions of me saying no, or saying that's too much, or that kind of thing. So trying to twist my language so it's like, what does support look like for you? In hopes that maybe I could do something, or I could find someone who could do it. Or just Googling, how do you help someone who's been through a traumatic situation? It's taking all that labor off of them, Googling it, and then checking back and saying, hey, I've heard that this is helpful for people who've been in your situation. Do you think that would be helpful for you? And then it's a simple yes or no answer, which takes all that labor off of the person who already has all that emotional labor on them. My takeaway was the way that you incorporated that was really great. And I felt safer and safer as we went through the podcast.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm so grateful, because I think one of the big takeaways I have, so funny, again, the connection between episodes. The last episode made me feel like I wanted to be a better friend, and made me more committed to community and to being part of a collective. And I think the impact of having this conversation with you today made me want to be a kinder, more inclusive human being, made me want to notice, what are ways in which I express myself, or choices that I make, like just including a picture or not having transcripts, how that impacts people. I feel even more committed to centering people with differences and providing space and a platform for people who have traditionally been either erased or misunderstood. I'm now a fan of smashing the Kyriarchy.
We have t-shirts.
I'm going to get a t-shirt.
I can send you a link. We have t-shirts.
Oh, fantastic. And I'm really, kind of getting again the intersections of all of the isms in a way that I didn't fully before. And, of course, my understanding of being neurodivergent and the ways in which that can both be a powerful positive identity, but then also the ways in which there are challenges, and those challenges are real, even if they're not as visible, and how to be more compassionate, open-hearted, and responsible for being a part of supporting somebody who has those challenges. So thank you so much for all of those amazing lessons and gifts.
Thank you so much. Well, I feel like, you were already on this journey, right? Like, this is one of the reasons why I agreed to do this podcast as opposed to other ones, is you're really focusing on taking your privilege and centering people. And I really admire that. And it's a very powerful experience to be able to be like, all of this stuff is old to me, right? Like I've already been discussing it for, almost a decade now. And so having your perspective on it, and it's very powerful and it's very freeing. And it's also gives me a source of comfort to know that, well, I can take the people who are already kind of on that radical journey. You're collecting the people who might actually not respond very well to me, and you're giving them that gentle ramp in a very kind and loving way, which is very magical work. It's amazing.
Thank you. Well, I hope this will be just the beginning of a lot more connection, and let's go conspire later about what we might be able to do together in the Mother's Quest community. And good luck as you finish your summer and you move into your school year. I'm excited to continue to see what you pull together and, what books we might find to ease us into the new year.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to help light the way on your quest. Seize the day. Love your people. Honor your gifts. Until next time.